Welcome, dear friends, to a poignant tale of love, loss, and redemption that proves that the bonds of family can withstand even the harshest tests of time. Enjoy the story. The crisp autumn air nipped at Elizabeth Parker's wrinkled face as she shuffled along the iron fence of Willow Creek Park. At 62, she moved with the hesitant gait of someone much older, her once vibrant blue eyes now clouded with years of sorrow. "Not today," she murmured, her gnarled fingers clutching her weathered purse. "I can't go in there today." For 7 long years, Elizabeth had walked this same path, always skirting the park's edge, never daring to enter. The laughter of children playing on the swings carried on the breeze, each giggle a bittersweet reminder of happier times. As she paused to catch her breath, a memory flashed unbidden before her eyes. Michael, her beloved husband, pushing their daughter Sarah on those very swings, the little girl's delighted squeals echoing across the park. "Oh, Michael," Elizabeth whispered, a tear tracing the deep lines of her face. "If only you were here. If only—" But Michael was gone, taken by a heart attack 5 years ago. And Sarah? Elizabeth's chest tightened at the thought of her daughter. Sarah, the light of their lives, had vanished into thin air 7 years ago, leaving nothing but a hastily scribbled note and a gaping hole in Elizabeth's heart. As she resumed her solitary walk, Elizabeth wondered, as she did every day, where she had gone wrong. How had their perfect family crumbled so completely, and would she ever find the strength to piece it back together? 22 years earlier, Elizabeth and Michael Parker stood hand in hand in the bustling foyer of St. Mary's Orphanage. At 40 and 44 respectively, they were older than most prospective parents, but their eyes shone with the excitement of newlyweds. "Are you sure about this, Liz?" Michael asked, giving her hand a gentle squeeze. "It's a big step." Elizabeth nodded, her heart racing. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life, Mike. This is our chance to be parents, to give a child a loving home." As they followed the orphanage director, Mrs. Hawkins, down a long hallway, Elizabeth's mind wandered to the years of failed fertility treatments, the disappointments, the tears. But today, she felt hope blooming in her chest for the first time in years. Mrs. Hawkins pushed open a heavy wooden door, revealing a large playroom filled with children of various ages. "Take your time," she said with a practiced smile. "Let me know if any of the children catch your eye." Elizabeth and Michael stepped into the room, immediately overwhelmed by the cacophony of young voices and the sea of hopeful faces turned their way. But as they stood there, unsure where to begin, a small figure caught Elizabeth's eye. A tiny girl, no more than 3 years old, was making her way across the room towards them. Her legs were thin and slightly bowed, causing her to walk with an awkward, swaying gait. But it was her eyes that captured Elizabeth's heart, enormous crystal blue orbs that seemed to hold all the wisdom and sorrow of the world. As the child reached them, she looked up at Elizabeth and said in a clear, sweet voice, "Mama?" Elizabeth felt as if the wind had been knocked out of her. She knelt down, bringing herself eye level with the little girl. "Hello, sweetheart," she said softly. "What's your name?" But before the child could answer, Mrs. Hawkins swooped in, gently pulling the girl away. "I'm so sorry," she said, her voice tight with false cheer. "Sarah here has some special needs. Let me introduce you to some of our other children." As Mrs. Hawkins led them away, Elizabeth craned her neck to keep Sarah in sight. The little girl stood alone in the middle of the room, her big blue eyes filled with confusion and longing. Later, in Mrs. Hawkins's office, Elizabeth couldn't shake the image of Sarah from her mind. As the director droned on about other available children, Elizabeth suddenly interrupted. "What about Sarah?" she asked. "The little girl with the leg problems?" Mrs. Hawkins' smile faltered. "Oh, I wouldn't recommend Sarah. Her medical needs are quite extensive. The cost alone?" "We don't care about the cost," Michael interjected, surprising even himself. He looked at Elizabeth, saw the determination in her eyes, and knew in that moment that their lives were about to change forever. "We want to meet with Sarah again. We want to adopt her." Mrs. Hawkins sputtered, clearly taken aback. "But But surely you'd prefer a healthier child, one without such complications? Elizabeth stood, her voice firm. No, Mrs. Hawkins, we want Sarah. Can you please arrange for us to see her again? As they left the orphanage that day, adoption paperwork clutched tightly in Elizabeth's hands, Michael turned to his wife. Are you sure about this, Liz? It's not going to be easy. Elizabeth smiled, her eyes shining with tears of joy. I've never been more sure of anything in my life, Mike. That little girl, she's meant to be ours. I can feel it. Little did they know, as they drove home filled with excitement and plans for the future, that their decision would set in motion a chain of events that would test their love, their strength, and the very foundations of their family. The next 5 years were a whirlwind of doctor's appointments, physical therapy sessions, and endless paperwork. But through it all, the Parkers' love for their daughter only grew stronger. Sarah, despite her physical challenges, proved to be a bright and determined child. With the unwavering support of her parents and the best medical care money could buy, she made remarkable progress. By the time she started kindergarten, her legs had strengthened considerably, and her distinctive waddle had all but disappeared. One sunny afternoon, as Elizabeth watched Sarah chase butterflies in their backyard, Michael came up behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist. "Penny for your thoughts, love," he murmured in her ear. Elizabeth leaned back against him, sighing contentedly. "I was just thinking about how lucky we are. Look at her, Mike. Can you believe how far she's come?" Indeed, watching Sarah dart about the garden, her golden curls bouncing in the sunlight, it was hard to imagine the frail little girl they had first met at St. Mary's. "She's amazing," Michael agreed. "Just like her mother." As Sarah grew older, she continued to thrive. She excelled in school, bringing home report cards filled with A's and glowing comments from her teachers. She took up piano and soon filled the house with beautiful melodies. And through it all, she remained the sweet, loving child who had first captured their hearts in that orphanage playroom. By the time Sarah entered high school, the Parkers had almost forgotten that she wasn't their biological child. They were a happy, normal family. Or so they thought. The night of Sarah's high school graduation was meant to be a joyous occasion. Elizabeth and Michael sat proudly in the auditorium, watching as their beautiful daughter, resplendent in her blue cap and gown, accepted her diploma with honors. As the ceremony concluded and families began to mingle, Elizabeth noticed a commotion near the stage. A woman, disheveled and clearly out of place in the sea of proud parents and excited graduates, was making her way towards Sarah. "Sarah?" the woman called out, her voice slurred. "Sarah, baby, it's me! It's your mama!" Elizabeth felt her blood run cold. She grabbed Michael's arm. "Mike!" she hissed. "We need to get to Sarah, now!" But they were too late. By the time they pushed through the crowd, the woman had reached Sarah and was clutching at her gown. "Look at you," the woman was saying, tears streaming down her face. "All grown up and successful. I knew you'd turn out just like me if I hadn't given you up." Sarah's face had drained of all color. She looked from the strange woman to her parents, confusion and horror dawning in her eyes. "Mom? Dad?" she said, her voice small and frightened. "What's going on? Who is this woman?" Elizabeth's heart shattered at the look of betrayal in her daughter's eyes. As security guards led the distraught woman away, Elizabeth reached for Sarah, but the girl jerked away from her touch. "You lied to me," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling with anger and hurt. "All these years you lied." Before Elizabeth or Michael could respond, Sarah turned and ran from the auditorium, leaving her parents standing amidst the whispers and stares of the other families. The drive home was silent, the air thick with unspoken words and suppressed emotions. As they entered the house, Sarah finally spoke. "I want to know everything," she said, her voice cold and distant. "No more lies." And so, with heavy hearts, Elizabeth and Michael sat down with their daughter and told her the truth about the orphanage, about her health problems as a child, about their decision to adopt her. As they spoke, Sarah's expression grew more and more closed off, her eyes hardening with each revelation. When they finished, Sarah stood abruptly. "I need some time," she said. I need I need to think. As she disappeared up the stairs to her room, Elizabeth turned to Michael, tears streaming down her face. "What have we done?" she whispered. "We've lost her, Mike. We've lost our baby girl." Michael pulled her close, his own eyes wet with unshed tears. "We'll get through this, Liz," he murmured. "We have to believe that. We'll get through this together." But as the weeks passed and Sarah grew more and more distant, Elizabeth couldn't shake the feeling that their perfect family was crumbling before her eyes, and the worst was yet to come. The morning Elizabeth discovered Sarah was gone started like any other. She knocked on her daughter's door, calling out that breakfast was ready. When she received no response, she assumed Sarah was still angry, still giving them the silent treatment that had become the norm over the past month. It wasn't until she opened the door, intending to leave a peace offering of Sarah's favorite blueberry muffins, that she realized something was terribly wrong. The room was immaculate, the bed made with hospital corners, a sure sign that Sarah hadn't slept in it. Elizabeth's heart began to race as she took in the empty closet, the bare desk. On the pillow lay a single sheet of paper. With trembling hands, Elizabeth picked up the note and read, "Mom and Dad, if I can even call you that anymore, I'm leaving. I can't stay here, surrounded by lies and pretense. My real mother needs me. She's sick and has no one else. I'm sorry for taking some money and jewelry. I'll pay you back someday, I promise. Please don't try to find me. It's better this way. Sarah." Elizabeth's legs gave out, and she sank to the floor, the note clutched to her chest as sobs racked her body. This was how Michael found her an hour later, alerted by her absence at his usual breakfast time. The next few weeks were a blur of police reports, private investigators, and sleepless nights. But despite their best efforts, Sarah had vanished without a trace. It was as if she had never existed at all. As the months turned into years, the strain began to show on both Elizabeth and Michael. Michael threw himself into his work, staying late at the office and bringing files home on weekends. Elizabeth, on the other hand, seemed to shrink into herself, spending hours staring at old photo albums or wandering from room to room in their suddenly too large house. 5 years after Sarah's disappearance, tragedy struck again. Michael, overworked and stressed, suffered a massive heart attack at his desk. By the time Elizabeth reached the hospital, it was too late. She was now truly alone. In the years that followed, Elizabeth aged rapidly. Her once vibrant auburn hair turned a dull gray, and deep lines etched themselves into her face. She sold the house, unable to bear the memories it held, and moved into a small apartment on the edge of town. Every day she would walk the streets of their city, always passing by Willow Creek Park but never entering. The park held too many memories, of family picnics, of Sarah's first steps without her leg braces, of a happiness that now seemed like a distant dream. As she walked, Elizabeth would find herself wondering, where was Sarah now? Was she happy? Did she ever think of the parents who had loved her so dearly? And would Elizabeth ever find the strength to forgive herself for the lies that had torn their family apart? 7 years had passed since Sarah's disappearance, and Elizabeth had settled into a routine of quiet despair. Her daily walks had become her only connection to the outside world, a way to pass the hours in a life that seemed to have lost all purpose. On this particular day, as she trudged along her usual route, lost in memories of happier times, a small tug on her coat broke through her reverie. Elizabeth blinked, focusing on the source of the disturbance. A young girl, no more than 5 or 6 years old, stood before her. The child was thin, her clothes worn and ill-fitting, but it was her eyes that caught Elizabeth's attention, enormous blue eyes that seemed hauntingly familiar. The girl held out a battered leather wallet, gesturing to Elizabeth's purse, which was hanging open. "Oh my!" Elizabeth exclaimed, taking the wallet. "Thank you, sweetheart. That was very honest of you." The girl shrugged, a small smile playing on her lips. As Elizabeth opened the wallet to make sure nothing was missing, an idea struck her. "You know," she said, "I think this calls for a reward. Would you like some ice cream?" The child's eyes lit up, and she nodded enthusiastically. As they walked to the nearby ice cream stand, Elizabeth couldn't shake the feeling that there was something special about this little girl. "What's your name, dear?" she asked as they waited in line. The girl looked up at her, then down at her shoes. She made a few gestures with her hands, but Elizabeth didn't understand. "Can't you tell me?" Elizabeth pressed gently. The girl made a frustrated gesture, then pointed to her throat and shook her head. "Oh," Elizabeth said, understanding dawning. "You can't speak, can you, sweetheart?" The child nodded, looking relieved that Elizabeth understood. As they sat on a nearby bench, enjoying their ice cream, Elizabeth found herself studying the girl more closely. There was something about her features, the shape of her face, that tugged at Elizabeth's memory. On impulse, Elizabeth opened her wallet and pulled out an old photo, one of Sarah at about the same age as this child. "This is my daughter," she said, showing the picture to the girl. "She looked a lot like you when she was your age." The reaction was immediate and shocking. The girl's eyes widened, and she pointed at the photo, her ice cream forgotten. Then, to Elizabeth's utter astonishment, the child spoke, a single word, uttered with great effort. "Mama?" Elizabeth felt as if the world had tilted on its axis. "What did you say?" she whispered, hardly daring to believe her ears. The girl pointed at the photo again, then at herself. "Mama," she repeated, more firmly this time. Elizabeth's mind raced. Could it be possible? Could this child be? No, it was too incredible to even consider. And yet... "Sweetheart," Elizabeth said, her voice trembling, "where is your mama? Can you take me to her?" The girl nodded eagerly, grabbing Elizabeth's hand and tugging her to her feet. As they set off down the street, Elizabeth's heart pounded with a mixture of fear and wild hope. After 7 long years of emptiness, was it possible that she was about to find her Sarah at last? The girl led Elizabeth through a maze of streets, each one seedier than the last. Finally, they stopped in front of a rundown apartment building, its facade crumbling and windows grimy. As they climbed the creaky stairs to the 3rd floor, Elizabeth's mind whirled with questions. How had Sarah ended up here? What had happened to her in the past 7 years? And this child? Could she really be Sarah's daughter? Elizabeth's granddaughter? The girl stopped in front of a battered door and knocked. There was no answer. She frowned, then pointed to a faded nameplate. S. Parker. Elizabeth's heart leapt into her throat. It was true. Sarah was here. Just then, a door across the hall opened, and a middle-aged woman poked her head out. "You looking for Sarah?" she asked, eyeing Elizabeth suspiciously. Elizabeth nodded, not trusting herself to speak. "She's in the hospital," the woman said. "Appendicitis or something. Little Emily here's been staying with me, but I can't keep her much longer. I've got my own kids to worry about." Emily. Her granddaughter's name was Emily. Elizabeth felt dizzy with the rush of emotions. "Which hospital?" she managed to ask. 20 minutes later, Elizabeth found herself standing outside a hospital room, Emily's small hand clasped tightly in hers. Taking a deep breath, she pushed open the door. The woman lying in the bed was a far cry from the vibrant teenager Elizabeth remembered. Sarah's face was gaunt, her once lustrous hair lank and dull. But when she opened her eyes and saw Emily, her whole face lit up. "Emily, baby, how did you get here?" Sarah exclaimed, then froze as she saw who was standing behind her daughter. "Mom?" The word hung in the air between them, loaded with years of hurt, regret, and longing. Elizabeth stepped forward, her eyes filling with tears. "Oh, Sarah," she whispered, "my sweet girl." For a moment, Sarah's face hardened, old resentments rising to the surface. But then Emily broke free from Elizabeth's hand and ran to the bed, throwing her arms around her mother. Sarah's eyes widened in shock, first at seeing her mother, then at the realization that Emily had led her here. She looked at Elizabeth, really looked at her for the first time, taking in the gray hair, the deep lines of sorrow etched into her face. "Mom," Sarah said again, her voice breaking, "I'm so sorry, I'm so sorry." And suddenly, the years of separation melted away. Elizabeth rushed to the bed, enveloping both Sarah and Emily in her arms. They clung to each other, all 3 generations weeping silently. When they finally calmed down, Sarah began to explain. She told Elizabeth about the disastrous reunion with her birth mother, a manipulative woman who had used Sarah's guilt and naivety to exploit her. She spoke of Emily's father, who had abandoned them when he learned Sarah was pregnant, of the struggles to make ends meet, of her determination to give Emily a better life than she'd had. "But I was wrong," Sarah concluded, her voice thick with emotion. "I already had the best life, the best parents anyone could ask for. I was just too blind to see it." Elizabeth stroked her daughter's hair, her heart overflowing with love and forgiveness. "We all made mistakes, sweetheart," she said softly. "But that's in the past now. We're together again, and that's all that matters." Just then, a doctor entered the room. "Mrs. Parker," he said, looking at Sarah, "we've got your test results. You're clear to go home tomorrow." Sarah bit her lip, looking uncertainly at Elizabeth. I don't really have a home to go to," she admitted. "Our apartment?" "Nonsense," Elizabeth interrupted firmly. "You're coming home with me. Both of you." She smiled down at Emily, who was beaming up at her. "We have a lot of catching up to do." As the doctor left, Sarah reached out and took her mother's hand. "Mom," she said hesitantly, "there's something else you should know. About Emily." Elizabeth squeezed her hand encouragingly. "What is it, dear?" Sarah took a deep breath. "She can't speak. Well, almost can't. It happened when she was just a baby. A neighbor's dog got loose and scared her so badly, she just stopped talking. The doctors say it's psychological, that she might speak again someday, but—" Sarah trailed off, her eyes filling with tears. Elizabeth felt a wave of compassion wash over her. How difficult it must have been for Sarah, dealing with this all alone. "Oh, my darling," Elizabeth said, hugging Sarah close. "We'll get her the best care, just like we did for you when you were little. Emily will find her voice again, I'm sure of it. And even if she doesn't, we'll love her just the same." As if on cue, Emily tugged on Elizabeth's sleeve and pointed to the window, where a small park was visible in the distance. Elizabeth laughed, a sound of pure joy that she hadn't made in years. "You want to go to the park, sweetheart? Of course we can. We'll go as soon as your mama is better." As she sat there, surrounded by her daughter and granddaughter, Elizabeth felt the weight of the past 7 years lifting from her shoulders. She thought of Michael, wishing he could be here to see this miracle, but somehow knowing that he was watching over them, smiling. Their family had been broken, but now it was whole again, different perhaps, but stronger for having weathered the storm. And as Elizabeth looked towards the future, she felt something she hadn't experienced in a very long time: hope. 3 months later, Elizabeth stood at the entrance to Willow Creek Park, holding Emily's hand. Sarah was on Emily's other side, smiling encouragingly at her daughter. As they walked into the park together, Elizabeth felt tears of joy prick her eyes. She thought of that day, so many years ago, when she and Michael had first brought Sarah here. How scared they had been, how unsure of the future. Now, watching Emily's face light up at the sight of the playground, Elizabeth knew that everything had happened exactly as it was meant to. Their family's journey had been long and often painful, but it had led them right back here, to this moment of perfect happiness. Sarah caught her mother's eye over Emily's head and smiled, a smile full of love and understanding. In that moment, Elizabeth knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, as a family. As Emily's silent but joyful expression lit up the park, Elizabeth silently thanked Michael, wherever he was, for the incredible gift he had given her all those years ago, the courage to open her heart and become a mother. And as she pushed her granddaughter on the very same swings where Sarah had once played, Elizabeth Parker knew that she had finally, truly come home.